But let me go ahead and introduce Tim DeBlock. Did I say that right?
Yep.
All right, so Tim DeBlock works for Antigen Security. He focuses on, or they focus on, incident response and cyber insurance. He'll elaborate, I'm sure, but his current title is he is the Director of Advisory Services. Let's welcome Timothy DeBlock.
All right, so we've only got 30 minutes. This is going to be pretty quick. You guys can hear me okay?
Yeah.
I feel like I can hear myself okay. All right, as mentioned, security Hitchhiker, Scott's API security. So this is the agenda. Who is the antigen? We've already mentioned some of it, so I'll skip some of that. Why this talk, API basics, how to secure your APIs, resources for API security, and then if we have time, we'll have questions. Of course, you can hit me up. I'll be at the conference. I have been doing hallway con all day. I meant to go to a couple talks earlier today and ended up talking to somebody else. So feel free to come up and talk to me if you have questions. I don't do about me slides. There'll be contact information at the end. Again, as we mentioned, we're cyber risk management for businesses, incident response. We can get you a deal on your cyber insurance if you need it, and then we do proactive services as well, like every consulting. You want it? Well, yeah, we can do that. So why this talk? Well, before AI came out, API security was a big topic at the end of last year. I built this at the end of last year. And as you'll see in the news section, there is no more API talk. It's all AI right now, but that doesn't mean APIs are not still out there. They are, and AI is probably actually helping create more APIs because developers are using it to write code. Whether or not you have it banned in your organization, by the way, they will go to their home machines and then just copy it over. It's not hard to get by. This also was meant to demystify APIs because everyone thinks about this new technology and goes, oh no, right? But it's really putting a lot of the same best practices in place. APIs have actually been around since the early 2000s, late 90s. So API in the news. I did try to look for a more recent API, and again, like I mentioned, there are none. It's all AI. It's all actually social engineering right now. If you have Okta, you're probably not having a great time. And then, of course, Cisco acquiring Splunk. So not a lot of talk going with APIs. But earlier in January 2023, T-Mobile lost 37 million customers PII via an API, right? That's huge. That's massive.
Yeah.
And that kind of foreshadows some of the issues with APIs. Sam Curry also came out with some research on 18 different vehicles. So if you own a BMW, Rolls-Royce, Ferrari, or a Hyundai, Genesis, Honda, Nissan, Infiniti, or Acura, your API could, someone can hack your car, essentially. And in the case of Ferrari, if you want a new Ferrari, you just need to go modify the owner information via an API. So this all came out of his research. So kind of that's why the talk. Here are the API basics. I actually had more slides that actually went into this until I found this meme like literally a month ago, and I think this does a really good job of giving people a great analogy for thinking about APIs, because I've tried to speak to GRC folks about what an API is, and it started with spaceships and ports and lasers, and they were just more confused than when we started. But I think this meme does a really good job of showing a restaurant, right? You got your back end, which is where your cooks are at, your front end where you go into the restaurant, and your APIs are your waiters, right? So, and your menu is your documentation. That's where you go and pick, what am I gonna go order from here? You give it to the waiter / API, they go to the back end, grab, and then deliver it to you, right? So I think that does a really good job. We'll still get into the API basics though. And the idea actually started in the 1940s, 1950s. Papers were written about in the 1960s and 1970s. The term started in the 1980s, and in the 1990s it actually expanded to remote procedural calls. So this has been brewing for a long time. And if I go to the Oxford Language Dictionary, and this is where I really struggled with understanding and trying to explain APIs, a set of functions or procedures allowing the creation of applications that access the features or data of an operating system, application, or other service. If you're confused, I was confused when I read that as well, right? Yeah, I got that. So I went to ChatGPT. ChatGPT says, and I don't normally like reading from slides, but I think they do a much better job of explaining APIs. API stands for Application Programming Interface. It is a set of rules, protocols, and tools for building software. application. An API defines how different software components should interact with each other. In simpler terms, an API is a way for different software systems to communicate with each other. It allows developers to create software applications that can access and use the functionalities of other applications, platforms, and services without having to understand the underlying code. So I think that does a much better job of explaining in much better terms. We'll dive into some examples here. Google Drive, right? That was my first thought because everyone understands Google Drive and what it is. You can download files, upload files, search for files and folders, share folders and drives. To collaborate, you can tap into other APIs. To further explain, I went to GitHub. A Fuse file system based on Google Drive was their top open source project. The second one was another Fuse wrapper for Google Drive. I don't know what Fuse is, full transparency. I actually had to look it up, but if you know what it is, it is. And then the one that I did understand was an FTP adapter for connecting Google Drive to the FTP. Didn't want to stop there. If you're into fantasy football, you can use this open source project to create weekly reports for your fantasy football league. And then, of course, being in security, of course, there's a red team tool that taps into your Google Drive and can exfil all your data. So if they get credentials to somebody's Google account, they can exfil it, right? So that's a really good example. Another one that I think a lot of people can identify with is Google Roads, which is just tracking where you're going, right? That's how we get the Google Maps information to avoid this area. Or if you're ordering DoorDash or Grubhub, you can see the person going to the store, picking up your stuff, and then delivering it to your house. Same thing with Uber and Lyft. A lot of package delivery companies too track their drivers now to make sure that they are doing like an efficient route to go deliver stuff, and they're not like going off to take a nap somewhere else, right? I see the drivers nowadays, like they come out with the package, they deliver it, and then they run back to the car because they're like on some sort of time crunch to get in. I'm also wearing an API, and probably some other people. This is a Whoop. If anybody, this is more of a fitness. It measures my cytology, tracks my sleep, my training, any sort of behavioral stuff. I can actually tap this into my phone on Google's Apple Health. So now we're doing APIs on top of APIs. So this is why APIs are kind of all over the place. And these are just a few examples, but you can see here there are several more just within the routes, maps section of the Google offering. And the reason why these APIs are out there is because instead of writing custom code for each one of these things, developers, they can just create something that people can tap into with defined parameters on how to actually use it. And so this actually empowers creativity and innovation. If developers had to continually write custom code for stuff over and over again, this would be a nightmare. Like they would be way behind on stuff. This is actually better for security as well, because with APIs, you have a defined way of interacting with it. You no longer have the SQL injection. Well, you still have SQL injection and some of these other injection things, but they're less of an issue, and we'll get into some of that in the security section. But essentially, you've almost eliminated cross-site script and some of this other stuff. It's actually a more nuanced issue within APIs. So the different types of APIs, REST is probably the most popular. SOAP is another one that you've probably heard about. That actually just got passed by GraphQL. As of this year, this is from the Postman State of the API report from 2022 and 2023. So last year SOAP was third, but GraphQL has passed that this year. So you can see there's a bunch of different APIs. If you've been in the development space, I honestly feel like this might be like a JavaScript thing where there's a new framework coming out each week, right? So we might see more APIs and different types of APIs. This is pretty straightforward. You have your private, which is your internal APIs, your partners. So partners would be an example of your CRM, your ServiceNow, your Workdays, anything that you're tapping into from a SaaS perspective, software application or software as a service. And then, of course, public, which we just went into. So let's talk about documentation now. Swagger and Postman are the way that developers can document APIs. Swagger is an open source software used with REST APIs tied to the Open API specification. And then Postman is a commercial API platform for developers to design, build, test, and iterate their APIs. If you want to get into the API security tooling space, your development team has to be doing Swagger and Postman files because that's what the security tooling needs to be able to use or actually look at the APIs. And we'll talk about the security tooling space. So, how to build an API? Well, I went to GitHub again, and it takes only 10 minutes for you to clone this project, npm install, and then npm run start, right? So you can just go to GitHub and find the APIs here. I also decided to use ChatGPT, because why not? The developers are already using it. This is a demo of me going to ChatGPT. You see these, whatever you think is best. I was like, well, you can have this API or this API. I was like, just you choose. I don't really care. I asked for an API for this presentation. So you can see here it's going through and creating it. It actually does a really good job of documenting it, but it's creating the actual code itself as well, right? So I don't really have to do anything. This is, I think, going to be a good thing for development. I've read the studies on security code review, and it doesn't do a great job. But as far as writing code and developing code and creating APIs, this is all developers have to do now. So a lot of people, and this is kind of a side AI rant, you're going to go from creators to editors, because this is not the final draft necessarily. This is a first draft, and then people are going to go edit it to use it for whatever their use case is. In fact, developers can take this code, put it in, test it out, and if they get errors, they can just put those errors in, and then it'll rewrite for them as well. So this actually, I think, helps security and development as far as keeping developers from the Stack Overflow, where they're going to the first answer that says turn off the security feature and everything works. Well, of course, yeah. And then, five comments down, it's like, no, you can't do that. You're going to turn off security. I think AI does a pretty good job of it's going to increase the quality of code that we see, but it's also going to increase the amount of code we're going to see. So APIs are going to continue to grow, as well as any sort of development code. Which leads me to who's using the APIs. Right now, it's only half of developers, or half of the respondents who are using APIs were developers. And this is again from the Postman State of the API report. Security, but if you've have a keen eye there, security got beat by CTOs and CEOs. So that's a little bit concerning. But this also explains why we have had a massive increase in APIs within the space, right? Is a lot more people are using it because it's a lot more accessible. That video I just showed, a minute 20 seconds. That's how long it took for me to spin up an API, or at least create an API. With that, we'll now dive into how to secure APIs. None of this should be a shocker if you've been in the security space for a long time. Inventory. You got to know where your APIs are at to actually be able to secure them. There is no silver bullet for finding APIs either. The vendors will tell you, but really they're just using a different technique. What I always recommend is work with the development group. And that doesn't account for all your APIs, by the way, as well, because the developers sometimes don't know where their APIs are at, because the developers come in and then they end up leaving. But work with the development team. I think a collaborative effort. A lot of, and you'll see, I'll show you some of like the Postman report, what they consider their top security concerns. They align pretty well. You can look for Postman and Swagger files in the repos to get access to their code. You can still look into the code to find stuff. That's if you have all the code in one repository. You might have to go to 5 different ones. Pen testers are really good at finding this stuff, right? If you're a pen tester, one of your first steps is to recon the environment. So pen testers usually have a better environment of the people that actually run the environment. And that's what a lot of security vendors are actually just doing, is they're just running a word list using like Burp Sweep or Zap against the environment, looking for the names that you would find in API documentation for those URLs. That's literally all they're doing. You can probably go to GitHub and find a word list. If not, I'll have AI write one for you. Vulnerability management too. If you have a pretty good vulnerability management program, you can go there to look for any sort of servers. That might be a web server that might indicate that there's APIs on there. EDR and your SIEMs, which has a lot of the logging and stuff. You can look in there for like traffic, which is another approach that some of the security tooling vendors take, is they are just going to tap into your network traffic and look for anybody interacting with the APIs. And then of course, again, like I said, work with your development group. They have a tool called the API Management Platform. that allows them to collect, inventory, log all their APIs. Requirement specifications, those are the two NIST standards there that have some form of API in them if you're a NIST person. I also like pointing back to development. Open API specification talks a lot about a lot of auth. You'll have the Open Web Application Security Project, OWASP. That's pretty standard. They've got cheat sheets in the top 10. Normally I'll let you read through this, but I'm not going to. I'm just going to blow it. Authentication, authorization are 4 of the top 5. So that's your actual issue with APIs. Is this more about configuration? Do people have actual proper authentication authorization? If you go back to the bottom there, it's more access issues. Server-side request forgery, which I would also argue is an authorization issue, is kind of your injection there, right? Misconfiguration, and then I also love that they just call out people don't know where their APIs are at. So those top 10s align with development, which they recognize improper authentication and authorization, insecure data leak, and then business logic flaws, right? Your business logic flaws are going to be something, for example, a retail company has a coupon code that that people can use. If that coupon code is not expired properly, people can check out over and over with the same coupon code, thus costing the business a lot of money. That's oh, before we get into that, but I love at the bottom too, we don't know where our APIs are at, so even the developers don't know where they're at. Right? But going back to the business logic flaws, this is why I like threat modeling. You can use threat modeling at the early stages of a project and development. You can also, I've used threat modeling afterwards too, to help document and really understand what is going on with a system that can include APIs within development. I've also used it in several IT projects as well too, so it's pretty effective. You can look for authentication, authorization, caching strategy, error handling, validation. All you're really doing is drawing a diagram on a whiteboard. All the, since the pandemic, all the different meeting, video conferencing stuff has whiteboards on it now, Teams, Zoom, whatever. And really, you are just drawing squares and arrows. I've messed with all of them. I've used the basic stuff in there. Always looking for something better. But and then once you draw the diagram, you're just really attacking it. What can go wrong with this? Threat Modeling by Adam Shostak is the book that I recommend if you're looking to get into threat modeling.
What's the name?
Threat Modeling by Adam Shostak. Manual testing, again, you want to do prior to release, business logic flaw. Like that's where pen testers can really try to mess with the business logic flaw stuff. I've had pen test teams, what they usually look for is tokens, credentials within the API, which leads to other issues as far as escalated privileging and compromising accounts. And then of course injection, you want to do fuzzing, look for any source of non-resource constraints, right? That's another attack, is if your API is open and it spins up new resources in the cloud, and someone's just hammering it, you might end up getting a really big bill from your cloud provider. So let's talk about tooling real quick. Which you can't see that. All right. So down here, that's API security. The rest of it is the API landscape for development, right? So it's still pretty massive, but API security is a small thing. When we're talking about tooling, we want to do, you can still do your basic application security program stuff, static application security testing, dynamic application security testing. If you want to know more about that stuff, come talk to me afterwards. Software composition analysis. And then as I mentioned, having things pushed into the API management console. If your dev team has that, you can really align with them and get them to push APIs into that, right? And then security doesn't have to own another tool, that's under the development. So let's talk about the API security tooling landscape, because I think this is important. It's not a silver bullet. It's still a maturing space. A lot of vendors pivoted from bot detection into the API space. If you have nightmares about running a web application firewall, security tooling is a web application firewall. That's one approach for stuff, right? So now you're not necessarily talking about application security. You're talking about network security, and then your security operations center, because those tools will create alerts based on actual usage within the API. But that's also a way that you can find APIs, like I mentioned before. The other way that I've seen tooling do it is that they will actually test within the development lifecycle. So they have testing focused on that. I'll call out the one vendor that I've seen doing that, but some of the other ones are just doing the WAF base, and they have like a side testing for it. Again, you can come talk to me after the talk if you want to learn more about the vendor space here. I don't endorse any specific vendors. This is from the OWASP page for API vendors. Some of the big names there: No Name, Salt, Synopsys, and Imperva, Traceable. Apogee is Google's API management platform, so I just wanted to call that out. The interesting tech I've seen, 42 Crunch, that's the one that they test within the developer's pipeline. That's their jam. They're not looking to do any sort of WAF stuff. And then I've never heard of Beagle Security Reblaze. Interested to learn more about that stuff. Resources for APIs. I read the Google API report. We have Postman's State of the API report from 2022 and 23. There are vulnerable APIs out there if you need to have your pen testers or people testing your stuff, or you want to learn more about actually attacking it. And that is just one of the many. There's also one called VAMP. I don't want to bog down the slides with this. I have a site called exploresec.com/API. All the resources, we'll dive into some of that stuff there. But from this conference and other conferences, I'll have stuff there as well. So if you need to, refer back to that stuff, I have my own website stood up for that. And then of course OWASP, which you've already talked about. I of course had to go to AI because I'm just really interested in AI right now. There are two books: API Security in Action, OAuth 2 in Action. 42 Crunch had an APIsecurity.io newsletter, which was interesting. Had some pretty good stuff on there. Pluralsight I always recommend as far as like just general IT and security training. Google Scholar, rvix.org. With that, questions. I think we have, a minute? 2 minutes per question? 3 or 4? Any questions on API security since they're into that?
Most of the time I've gone over API stuff, people always talk about your developers. What we had is a internal customer wants to buy an application that has an API out to the vendor backend somehow.
Right.
How do I validate that secure?
So you're talking about third-party risk at that point,
Yes.
right? Yeah. So I mean, that's where your vendor management. You have to ask the right questions, and you're asking about how are they, doing development on that stuff. Does security get involved in that? You also can potentially have, I had an internal team where if you have your own pen testers, you could have them go test the API if the company's willing to, right? It kind of depends on the scenario. Some of the bigger players are going to be like, no, go away. Here's a third, or you can ask for a pen test report as well too. But that's kind of the way you can really have some sort of assurance, really. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
I mean, it's fairly simple, right? It's just checking to see if they're doing the right things, and then if you can test it, I would recommend if you have internal pen testers, or just even ask for a third-party pen test that shows that they've tested that. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
No, actually, just building on that question is, if the vendor provides like a specification and they don't mention anything about transport layer security, it's already a red flag because that means you have to roll it yourself.
Right.
So they already failed pen test number 1.
Yeah.
But yeah, good points.
Yep.
So we do have a couple of prizes that we want to give away. Do you have a question or two for the audience that we might be able to see if anybody can get right?
How many?
2.
We have 2.
Yeah, the first is a USB Wi-Fi adapter. We have a
Black Hat GraphQL. Look at that. That is a beefy book. And then what is this?
Wi-Fi adapter.
I got 2 questions. Do you want one of these? Which one do you want? This one? Okay. You want the book?
I'll take it.
Black Hat for GraphQL. Look, we've solved this very easily. Did you have a question?
Well, so API basically is a security tool between the user and the program, pretty much, right? I mean, it could be used as such, right?
Well, I mean, I think it goes back to, like I said, I think API security is an advancement. It's better for security because, again, you're eliminating a lot of vulnerabilities because you're really, with an API, you're defining how someone should come in and use it. Now, that doesn't mean there's not abuse cases, but it does improve security overall.
Isn't an API basically a mediator between the user and the external code, running code.
Yes. Yeah, so I mean, if you, and going back to the restaurant example, right, it's like your waiter, so that would be your way you're communicating to the restaurant that I want this food.
Yeah, and the way we're carrying all this food, cool with that.
All right, we are out of time. Please get with Tim if you have any other questions, but let's give Tim a round of applause. Thank you.
Contact information is